So my name is Kevin Mack, and I'm talking about style guides. My Twitter handle is Nice Transition. Leading up to this presentation, I posted a series of videos that were related to style guides, and they're kind of deeper dives and additional content that didn't align to the design track for M3. So these were things like methodologies, deep dives into design concepts, as well as front-end architecture and some of the really nerdy stuff that I get into. Eric was featured in one of those videos, so you can see all that content on Nice Transition, and I post way too much, but hopefully they're helpful bits and pieces of, or videos that can help your teams out and learn something new. Click. There we go. So I'm a co-founder with Adam Weiss of the Columbus Web Group and an organizer with Sean Duran, who actually just presented before me. He was somewhere in this room but ran off. We put on monthly meetups, and our whole idea is to inspire and educate the community of Columbus. So we do once a month a meetup that is either for designers, developers, project managers, or anyone that's looking to learn. So if you guys aren't a part of Columbus Web Group, I encourage you to sign up. It's just columbuswebgroup.com. We put a lot of content out on CBus Web Group on Twitter. So outside the monthly meetups, we do what's called weekend workshops that are 1 to 4 week-long courses that are personalized educational experiences. So what we do is, if you get in the class, we send you an email and we say, what's your background? What do you want to get out of the class? And we base the course around you. So we're always looking for suggestions. So if you have an idea, you can tweet at us, and we'll work really hard to find an instructor to do that. With the monthly meetups, we work really, really closely with our presenters, sometimes 4 to 6 months out in advance. And with that, we always tell our presenters to share a little bit about themselves. Typically, I don't do that, and trying to do as I preach today. So I'm going to give a little bit of a story about where my passion and love for what I do came from. And style guides are one of my favorite topics to talk about. So on the screen here is a photo of my mom, and my mom's here today. I did not know that she'd be here, so yeah. So I'm not a shy person, but I feel like I'm getting kind of joked up on this. So this is a photo of my mom teaching an art class. So she would teach after-school programs and at the rec centers, so kids that wanted to learn. She was also a mentor to kids about art and design. She's one of my greatest inspirations, and I learned so much from her. She was an art director at the Washington Post, so here's a photo that she did that was in the Washington Post. So this is early 80s, so she worked at the Washington Post in the 70s. And she's one of the greatest artists I've ever met. My mom is also my best friend. So the thing that I like to say about her is I learned how to be passionate and to do what I really love. So every single day I wake up and I want to do something really awesome. And I got that from her. So a job to me isn't just work. It's what I love to do and what I'm passionate about. After the sentimental part. So today I work at Cardinal Solutions. I'm our creative director. I'm responsible for anything creative or digital for Cardinal. That's brand strategy, digital marketing, as well as digital branding. So one of our key deliverables that we have are style guides, and that's what I'm talking about today. So getting into the outline slide here. First going to go into, it's out of order, I switched slides at the last moment. But I'm going to talk about tacos, and it'll make sense afterwards. I love tacos. Everyone loves tacos. And then I'm going to make sure that you have a clear definition of what a style guide is, the contents of what goes into it, the layers of the style guides, which is something I came up with to organize style guides, go into the kind of the pain points of who owns style guides and those conversations that you must have inside your organization, the process it takes to create a style guide, as well as how you utilize them inside your projects. Pain points, and everyone loves those. And then ending on a happy note with our benefits. And if you guys meet my mom, she loves talking to people. She's an awesome person. So tacos, who loves tacos? Yeah, cool. So I came up with this analogy on Cinco de Mayo this year. And I was hanging out with a buddy. We were having some margaritas. And one of the frustrations that I've had being more on the technology side or working in this industry for so long, I live and breathe this every single day. So when I'm talking to someone that's maybe on the marketing team or isn't a UX person, a designer, or a developer, they can easily get confused. So this is where the analogy came from. It's actually an acronym. So TACO stands for Talk About Component Organization. Getting into it. Here's a taco shell. Oop, here's a taco shell. Repeat. Here's a corn tortilla shell. Inside a corn tortilla shell, you have ingredients. We put lettuce inside of it. We put tomatoes inside of it. We put protein in it. Then we put some cheese. Now we have a taco, right? Now if I want multiple tacos, what I can do is use those same ingredients and then have 3 tacos. So now I have a list of tacos here. Now if I want to introduce, say, I'm not in the mood for tacos, but I want something else. And I say I want a quesadilla. So we create this awesome effect here. And we have a flour tortilla. Well, what goes inside the quesadilla? We have lettuce, we have tomato, we have some protein that looks like crap, we have some cheese, and then we end it with a flour tortilla at the top, and it bounces. So now we have 2 unique products that are completely, different use cases of eating, maybe different moods, but 2 products that are from the same 4 ingredients with a variable 1 other ingredient. So 5 ingredients to make a taco and quesadilla. Now, if we look at the burrito, flames. Now we have a burrito, and the burrito has tomato, lettuce, protein, and cheese in it. The unique thing about the burrito and the quesadilla here is they're the exact same ingredients, but they're used in different contexts. So here we have 3 unique products that are being listed out, made of the same inner parts, but kind of creating unique experiences to enjoy them. So when you're building out a style guide, you need to think about not just like I'm building a taco or a quesadilla or a burrito. I'm building out the core pieces that make it up. And it really gets into this idea of reusing, combining, and creating when necessary. And I say creating when necessary, so it's really the focus on reuse and combining. And that's what style guides are. You have a listing of all these components, you're reusing them, combining them, and creating when necessary, and you make tacos. So that's my analogy on that. The digital style guide, kind of getting into more of the definition of it. So what's contained inside of a digital style guide? So these are design patterns. These are common things that are inside of an interface. These are things like the media object. That's like the Facebook, your avatar with your messaging off the left-hand side. You see that pattern all the time on the web. There are other multiple patterns that are used, but just think about common patterns that you see. And they can be unique to an experience or an application. They contain styles and markups, which is your HTML and CSS, for these components, so individual components being listed out and being referenced. They contain visual representation of them, so you can actually see them, as well as copy and visualize the code. They contain actual code that can be copied, pasted, utilized by the development team, and documentation. Documentation is probably the most important one. So the documentation can be on use cases and how to implement, but as well as the guidelines of the do's and don'ts for the brand. So this is kind of the core of what goes into a style guide. A really important thing to think about is when you're building out a style guide, you're not just putting out individual components. You have to think about them in their variant contexts and the modified versions of them. I'll show an example on my next slide. And the context is what's really important, especially with responsive web design. An individual component can shift from small screens to large screens. The style guide needs to represent those or show all the different variants of that individual component. So as I said, it's a focus on RWD, and that should be included inside of a style guide. Getting into that example, so here we have a desktop design. It's just a arbitrary design. And for responsive web design, or RWD as I have on my last screen, the idea is you have one code base and it can work in many variant contexts. One of those contexts is screen resolution, so a screen gets smaller. You need to adapt your design to fulfill the needs of the content. So here we have the mobile view of it. So it's the same code, but represented in 2 different ways. Why bring this up and talk about the context and as well as the modified variant versions? So here we have this 2-column grid here, and then on mobile it goes into a single column grid. So inside my style guide, I'd want to represent and document both the desktop version, but then how it translates to mobile, so you can see it actually come into play. Then also include the variance of it. Maybe on the desktop it's 2-column, and then that continues all the way down to the mobile size. And then you may want to have a variation of it where it's like 2-column to 1-column on the desktop. So that's what I mean by variant context of it. And you want to just keep that in account with almost everything that you're building out and representing it and making sure people can see it. This is one of my favorite examples of a style guide. So this is the Alaskan style guide. You can Google it and find it. A lot of people think when style guides, they think about these listing of all these buttons. So, all these individual components. So right here, it's a listing of all the buttons. It's kind of blurry to see. But what they have is reference to the actual components, reference to a JS bin where the developer team can actually utilize, implement, modify it. And it also contains the documentation and code. So that's where people think a lot of style guides kind of begin and end. But where Alaskan kind of went above and beyond was they put brand guidelines in here, as well as how we design. So it includes our design approach. It includes these personas. So as the development team and the design team is developing things, they're thinking not just about the design and the components that they're building, but really about who the audience is. And it has reference through that even in the components section. It's really, really cool. And as a designer, this is probably one of the most frustrating things is where do I find my resources? It's like I use Dropbox. I know where my things are. But in that moment of like, I'm rushing to try to find something, you may struggle to find it. So they include their resources on their style guide. So it becomes kind of the one place for design references, their philosophies on design, as well as their components, HTML and CSS. And in the top section, they also include other types of applications and designs. So here's that listing out of the Photoshop and the sketch files. This is really, really awesome. I wish my company had this. But then at the bottom, they just have some of their guiding principles to remember, and I think that's just really awesome. So if you're thinking about building out a style guide, this is kind of like the holy grail of style guides and what you need to kind of approach and use as a reference. It's my favorite example. All right, I'm kind of an extreme broken record when I'm talking about application development and design. The idea, especially when focusing on style guides, is to create something that's scalable. By scalable, I mean that it's far-reaching across multiple applications. It's not just one application that you're building. So style guides are supposed to be applied to multiple applications. Maintainable, meaning that it's easily updatable, and over time it can grow and change. And one of the most important pieces that I throw in there is flexible. And by flexible, I mean that you're designing for your known infrastructure right now and the known applications and experiences that you know, but the unknown for the future. So trying to keep those in account, those question marks, like what is our next application? What is the content that we'll be having to design for? And I'll hit back on scalable, maintainable, and flexible throughout this presentation. So what's contained inside of a style guide? There's a lot of things, and this is kind of a more shorter list. And before getting into the list of things, really just taking a step back and talking about the core of it, it's really this front end. And it's CSS, JavaScript, as well as HTML. I don't put HTML in here because that's just part of the front end that I find should just be inherited. But so this is the front end. And by front end, it's the pieces of part of the interface that people are interacting with, so the code side of it. It's a visual representation of how you're going to form, structure your data, and represent it. I used to go back and forth and say JavaScript was not included in Style Guide. But nowadays, I definitely include it. And we put out a video, Eric and I did 2 days ago, talking about JavaScript architecture for a Style Guide. And you can do it across multiple platforms as long as you plan for it. So we now include JavaScript in the Style Guides that we create for our clients. Of course, the CSS and all the components. So this is what makes up Style Guide. It's not really back-end languages. You can use different toolkits that maybe build it, but the code that you're actually having there is a reference to front-end code. With the Style Guide, it's really the focus on the interface as well as the experience that you have. So when you're designing an interface, it's kind of equal to think about the experience that you're building out. So the interface are those visual representation, those components, but the experience of how people are interacting with those individual components. And I have an awesome cheesy fade or animation here. But this is really the most important piece, is the content. And it's intentionally wrapping around the content. So as we build for the web or any application that you have, the primary focus is on content. And then you're saying, how can I create an experience around this content? How can I create an interface around this content? And they kind of, by combining these three things and thinking about this in a style guide, especially individual components, you're on your way to success. Getting into some of the core pieces, so branding. And this is really in the reference of digital branding. So digital branding is a translation of maybe a traditional brand for the web. And there's some variants that you have to take in account, like different screen devices, resolution, accessibility is a huge one. It's the extension that kind of goes through this rest of this list. So typography is a part of the branding. These are, say your brand has a really nice brand font, but you say, we want that on the web, and someone looks it up and you're like, that's gonna cost us 500 grand a year. You have to have that decision to say, what is our brand font for digital experiences? I'm gonna kind of go into a slight deep dive about typography later in this presentation, but it's just typography is included in there. Call to actions, these are your buttons, your CTAs, your anchors, how people get from one experience to another. The Alaskan one, even though it was blurry, believe me, it was listing out all the different buttons that they had. This is core inside of a style guide. Media treatments, by this I mean it's imagery, it's background treatments, it's video too. So how are you going to represent it? There can be guidelines on even sizes. So say across all my site I have a lot of icons. I don't want to have one page where there's icons that are 300 pixels, the next page is 200 pixels, the next page is 150. So identifying and putting these out there and creating those guidelines. Form elements, really no interface can exist without forms, and it's just one of those core pieces, so it's the pieces part people interact with and submit data. It's also one of the hardest things to visually design in an interface from CSS and make it cross browsers. So a lot of thought has to go into it. List items, and these contain your unordered list, your order list, your definition list, but more importantly, it's how different components are related to each other. So the stacking of blocks of content and maybe the spacing in between. So how they all come together in a list form and the patterns there. Structural is how you're displaying the content. So these are your grid systems, the tabular data. It's how the pieces and parts come together and you create the experience, especially on the responsive side. There's a lot to go in here, and I'll talk about stress tests later, which comes back to that. Navigational. So there's what I refer to as a global style guide, and there's application style guide. In the global layer, when you're doing navigation, you need to think about design patterns for navigation, not necessarily building out a full header, because a header is going to be contextual to the experience that you're building out. Navigation is one of the hardest things to kind of create. This is one size fits all. So it's more about representation of design patterns for navigation, not necessarily the navigation itself. And as you get into more of the application side, you can have those actual navigation that's based around the content. The utility and helpers is maybe more on the nerdier side, but these are what are more like classes, and they're used to extend the components that you have. So I create a block content that has maybe a header, block of content, and then a call to action at the bottom. Say on some pages I want it to be centered, some pages I want it to be right aligned, left aligned. I can use a utility helper to change the alignment of it, but keep the same components. So they're used to extend or make modifications to an existing component. Those are really, really important. A lot of people forget to add those in style guide. And then the last and probably the most important is actually the front-end UI architecture. So if we look at this list, the top is branding and it trickles all the way down. So branding goes throughout all of these. But the UI architecture is kind of the home for all of this. And by front-end UI or user interface architecture, I'm talking about that front-end, the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. And it's making sure that it's crafted in a way that is scalable, maintainable, and flexible. And again, it goes back to let's create interface components that are based around the content. So that where that interface item and the experience comes together. And having someone that has an extreme experience in front end, especially the architectural side, is a near requirement for a style guide. So if someone asks you what's included in a style guide, this is kind of the starting list and where to begin. So I've been creating style guides, I would say at least for the past 6 years. I started web development in '95. I grew up, as I said, around art and being inspired by my mom. and kind of the two worlds came together. And as I started building out bigger applications, I realized a lot of common patterns and reuse. So I made a lot of mistakes when I started developing. It was just like, I can design this, I can design this. Oh, I don't need to reuse something. I wanted to create a unique experience. But there was this turning point, I would say about maybe 10 years ago, where I was like, instead of creating variants and trying to be creative and overly designy, I said, how could I reuse the pieces of parts and start making the experience easier to develop as well as just quicker to get done. So with that, I started like going off to the side and building out listing of components that were like in an HTML file that I would copy and paste in my projects. The term style guide, pattern library, component library started coming around. I got really into it. Starbucks was really the first one that stood out from the crowd. And it kind of, everyone started thinking about, well, that's just not front-end UI architecture. It's something that we should be doing on every single project. But with that, I always took the approach of the style guide was for a single application. And what I realized was that I was doing it completely wrong. So I created what's referred to as the 7 layers of the style guide. It starts with the global, it goes into the brand, then goes into the application, and then the campaign. So the idea here is at the global level, these are the most far-reaching components. So these are your core components, your structures. This contains the HTML, CSS, as well as JavaScript. These are things like your button, those items that were in those lists. So navigational patterns can be included in there, as well as form elements. Again, that list that I had out there. But these would be the components, no matter how many applications you had, you could say and almost guarantee that these components are going to be on every single application that we build. The brand is more on the theming layer, but it can also get specific. And I'll explain what that means in a couple moments, but these are extending these components from the global layer and adding additional styling to it and bringing your brand to life to these components. The application is really where I've changed the architecture and my thoughts around things. So before, this is where I always lived when building out a style guide, or I tried to do too much in the global layer. So at the global layer, I was building out a single style guide that was being used across multiple projects. But then I would find my projects having bloat or a lot of download and big CSS files because I was building out multiple interfaces in one space, but those components and those structures didn't make sense outside of the application that I was building. So for today, and the way that we architect stuff is there's a global style guide, and then there's individual application style guides that are extensions of it. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then the last one is campaign. So while working with clients and also building out style guides, say you're running a holiday campaign and you work with another agency to get it done. Someone asks, oh, you have a style guide. All right, let me have let me have access to it. And they start adding to it and breaking some of the core pieces. They do different methodologies, approaches, and it starts falling apart. In addition to that, they don't use the style guide, and it's just this free-floating thing off to the side, and it doesn't work inside your system. You try to integrate it, and there's a lot of battling of the styles from specificity wars as well as just inheritance of CSS. So the idea here is that you're taking all those top layers and applying them to this campaign, and if you're working with a third-party agency for a short-term campaign, that they have reference to the global as well as the application, and then they're extending it and creating these unique, almost throwaway pieces that are going to live around for a short time. The other side of this is not just for campaigns like a Christmas campaign, but it could also be an individual page or section of your website. So say you had a company that had multiple business divisions, but the About page was shared across all your applications that you had out there. And that application or that About Us section could have a timeline and a unique experience. But that component and design isn't going to exist anywhere outside the About page. So you think, instead of doing this, we have reference to the campaign, this About page, and it's kind of separated out. And that can be thrown away at a later time. Now, as I said, I would get back to brand. So global is kind of consistent, and global is really nice because if you build out a structure, it can be used for multiple companies and brands. So we're working on at Cardinal, we're working on an open source project that's going to be at this global layer, as well as the architecture for these following layers. So trying to help out some of the people in the community. So the brand trickles down. we have this green brand that goes all the way down. Say we have another brand that's blue, and it also trickles down. So imagine you're a retailer and you have a kids brand and a brand for adults. So you may want to have the visuals and the brand be completely different, or maybe include different components that are unique to those different experiences. But the cool thing about this, and I'll show this on the next slide, is that you're utilizing the same HTML and DOM structure and the same patterns of building it out. You're just changing the theming for it. Now under the brand, I'm going to switch from retail and say that we're a bank. So say that we're a bank and we have two applications within my brand. So I'm a bank, I have my marketing side, my .com, which is telling everyone about my brand. And then I have my portal where users go into and they see their information about their accounts. Now, there is overlap there, but the overlap kind of comes from the combination of the global and the brand. These would be things like your buttons, form fields, and some of the structural stuff. But there's a very unique look and feel in different components because the content's going to be extremely different from a utility tool like an online banking versus a marketing tool, which is the .com. So instead of combining those and putting them into something that's going to be across all my projects, you separate them out, the components that are inside there, and the additional HTML, CSS, and you can reference them as you need it. But then say that I built something inside the portal or the member online banking, and I realized that that also works really well on our marketing side. What I could do is bubble it up from the application layer and apply it to my brand layer, and then make it be accessible for all my other applications moving forward. So the idea here is that you are able to scale without adding bloat to your projects and maintaining it. And when I say multiple style guides, it's really just one style guide. So thinking about that Alaskan one, they had that application or product and they go into deep products. But instead of having like a call to action like that, you'd say applications. And you click there, you'd still have all the reference to the global components that are branded for that branch that you're in, and then all the unique components for it. So it becomes that reference for everything. Now, staying on the bank, say you're a bank and you have 3 different campaigns that are really tiny, but it could be something for a credit card, it can be something for a mortgage, or whatever it may be. And it lives underneath that application, so you inherit all those components and then you're extending them. So far, is that making sense? Is anyone bored? I'm looking at you. All right, cool. So kind of bring this into more technical, but I hope it kind of brings it all together. So here's a button. How many people know what a button is? All right. My mom even knows. That's great. So here's a button, and here's the HTML structure for it. The C stands for component. So this is one of the methodologies or approaches for crafting out our architecture that we use. So we say something like C, which stands for component. So it's the actual organization of our code. We follow BEM at Cardinal, and the double dash means a modifier. So we have component, button, and then the 2 different modifiers that are being applied here. And what this does is when you look at the CSS for this, this is almost a reset. So this would be at the global layer. I can say all my buttons across all my applications receive this kind of styling and reset, because as a brand, I want it to look this way. Now, when I introduce a brand to it, so we have this blue uppercase custom font inside here, we are extending the CSS and the styling of this. So far, the DOM structure up here on the left hand hasn't changed. It's utilizing the same structure, but all I've done is apply new styling to it to give it a new, unique look and feel. CSS is a language of not overwriting or overwriting. What that means is if you use something like Chrome Developer Tools and you right-click and you say inspect, you see these slashes through it. That means that's bad CSS code and bad architecture on the front end. The idea of CSS is really to extend and apply the CSS properties when necessary. For those that don't know CSS, it's awesome. It's complex. And then we have brand, the second brand here, and it has a unique look and feel. And all we've done was change some of the CSS properties, and they're being extended. So all 3 of these have the same DOM structure. They have the base of this, and then we're extending it and creating 2 variants of it. So modifying them. Ownership. This is my favorite conversation. I've had some of these conversations with people in this room. I love building these out. I love designing. I love the development side of it. I love seeing the benefits of style guides. What I don't like is this conversation, the ownership of it. How many people here have a style guide inside their company in some form or another? Cool. Who owns that? Just shout. Like marketing? Okay, cross different? UX. Okay, cool. So inside of an organization, there's IT, there's marketing, there's user experience, there's QA, and then there's the business side. So sometimes IT is under marketing in some organizations. Sometimes marketing's under IT in other organizations. Sometimes they both report to business. Sometimes they're just floating somewhere in the who knows where. Same thing goes with user experience. There's always this conversation that happens in the early days of a style guide. Who's going to own it? And a lot of times it gets to like, well, the IT team, the developers need to create it, so they should own it. And then they're like, well, but in the long run, marketing needs to utilize it. But they're like, no, the developers are going to be using that too. But what about the branding? We have our brand style guide, this big, thick PDF. Who owns that? UX is like, well, we're kind of in the middle of everyone, and we're everyone's friends. They're like, we can own it. But in reality, this style guide isn't owned by just one department or one person. It should be shared across all of them. So as I talked about the global versus the application, it becomes really, really important. And thinking back to that Alaskan version where it's not just listing out index of UI components, it's a lot more than that. And as a business, that decision needs to be made, who owns it, but I always recommend that it's kind of a shared effort and think of it as any project. Everyone's contributing to it and everyone here has benefits of it, and the cost for it is hopefully someone will just write a check for it. But I don't have an answer for that side of it. But the idea here is that everyone kind of shares and owns it. The creation. So as I said, this is talking about both the creation of a style guide as well as how they can be utilized and kind of combined. So here we have the first step is to do a brand strategy. And there's a lot of different things that go into a brand strategy, but it's identifying what the brand is, the essence of it, what does it really mean, and how does it translate to the digital space. A lot of companies, when people started getting online in the late 90s and really around that mid 2000s when everyone was like, marketing owns the website, we need to be here, and the lead acquisition. No one really thought much about the brand strategy in the digital space. It was just like, here's our brand, now let's make our brand and put it on the web. But the web's a completely different platform than designing for a print ad or a newspaper ad that may be out there, or a package. They're completely different contexts, and the brand needs to evolve or change for it. This is a conversation that I have a lot with our clients, and I focus on the strategy for a brand and the conversion of it. The user research. So as you're, before you're starting a style guide, going out and talking to your customers about your current brand or the pieces and parts. You can also use that to identify and start road mapping some of the future projects that you have. But thinking about what you're currently doing wrong on the web, identifying it, and then also bringing like your stakeholders and the brand people. So even though you may define and start thinking about the brand, it's going to change and adapt once you get inside the browser, and trying to collaborate with as many people as possible on it. And then as it's actually built out, kind of putting structures together that people can test, and then doing research on that so it goes on both sides. User research should always be continued throughout this. Indexing components. So this is looking at your current infrastructure and all the applications that you have out there. Identifying every single one. This may sound crazy, but what I actually like to do is print them off. So take screenshots and print them off. There's something about the physical space of taking online components and sticking them on a wall or having this table that looks like you've gone insane to help you organize. But that's the way that I like to do it. I was working on a big redesign for a bank, and we went through their online portal as well as their website. We counted over, it was at least 130 buttons. And they were all almost unique. I would say about 70% of them were unique. And some other ones were like variants of it. It's like, how does that even happen? By the time we were done creating their style guide, we only had 3 left. And they didn't even understand why there were so many buttons on there. And it became that consistent thing. So indexing it. Style tiles, and a lot of people are thinking that these are going away, but I'm actually a huge fan of it. So for those that don't know what a style tile is, I like to explain it as this. If I'm redesigning my bathroom or my kitchen, say I don't have design expertise, so I hire a designer to come in, and they kind of interview me, and they say, what do you like? And I explain to them, and maybe they show me some pictures. We then have a meeting, and they show me maybe like this grouping or this grouping, and it's maybe some swatches on colors for the walls, the flooring, whatever it may be. And they try to guess in the initial state, but based off of talking to me before, what are kind of moods for me. And that's what a style tile is. It's that initial identification for the brand and translating it to the web. So putting it in front of people, seeing how people react, and then using that as kind of the first pivoting point to getting into your brand. They're really throwaway. It's about driving the conversation and evolving your brand. Now, the element collage, this was probably the biggest game changer, and I have a representation example of this on my next slide. But this was created by Dan Mall, and these are individual components that aren't designed. These were probably similar to like GUI toolkits that you can find like on Dribbble that started around like the late 90s. But the element collage are these individual components, but not only individual components, they're showing states of them. So hover states, active states, and the ways that people may interact with it. They list out, well, I'll show that on the next slide. Stress test, this is something I came up with my buddy Andy Hill. We were working on a project that was very data-driven, a lot of tabular data. So we came up with what's called a stress test. So as I was saying earlier, structures and the translation of from small to large. That becomes really difficult when you have to deal with a number that say is 9 million or 9 billion, and you have this much space to fit that in. So we came up with this, and it was this identification of minimum characters as well as maximum characters for a component. And we would start with our requirements and usually actually look inside the database and say, what is the maximum character count that can go from that database that can be populated inside the structure? And we based our designs around it, and then we would start testing them across the responsive landscape. And if we realized that we were wrong, we would update our design. And with this, there's really two different ways to approach designing of containers and structures. This is kind of confusing, so I'm going to say this really slow. There's content containers, so content containers and containers for content. So far, are you following me? So content containers, containers for content. I need to think of a better name for containers for content because I get confused when I'm saying that out loud. So content containers versus containers for content. Content containers are flexible, so they're flowable for whatever the content is. There's no maximum limits inside your structure. So this would be something like a large block of paragraph. You're not going to have a character count there. That structure is going to flow and fulfill the needs of it. Where the container for content has the restrictions on it. This could be like a hero message where you have a title, or maybe even titles for the page. You have to have a limitation on it because it breaks the design. Now, if you realize that your initial thought and some of the data or content changes, you need to go back and update it or make a modified version of it. So the stress tests are a part of that in identifying how the content actually is fitting inside those containers. It's kind of annoying to do. Context, and these are especially how people are interacting with your experience, your interface. In early days of mobile, so I started doing mobile design in probably really early days. I was on my BlackBerry. It was when the first web browser came out. We've written some stupid languages to do it. And I remember thinking about even navigating through the BlackBerry dial. It's hard to even remember that time period. But and then when it evolved to the first Android phone that came out in America, and it was really awesome. I can't think of the company that did that, but I worked on their campaign. I don't know. They're one of the Android brands still today, but they were the first one that came out with touch. And then it got really popular when the iPhone came out. And then everyone was still not really understanding how to design for mobile. And one of the hardest things to do was the clicking of buttons. So there's different ways that people say the average index finger. I looked this up the other day and someone said it was 45 pixels. But I like to say it's somewhere between 35 and 45 pixels, which is the average size of the index finger. We usually aim for 40 pixels when we're building out our interface in any clickable area. So when you're designing components, you want to make sure that you're thinking about different contexts of how people are going to be interacting with it, and call to actions being something like 40 pixels by 40 pixels wide. Another thing is if your experience can adapt or change with enhancements. So if sliding or swiping or gestures are involved with it, you're building it around it. A lot of them actually are aligned with the accessibility guidelines, so the Web Content Accessibility Guideline document. If you're following that, you're kind of building out an application that's going to be scalable, flexible, and maintainable, and fulfill those needs. One of the unknowns in the future is after you get past this mobile world and voice starts becoming more and more of a thing, there's a talk going on, I think it's right now, about voice-guided experiences. And how that works is, again, you build out an interface and you're following those guidelines, but the input tool has just changed. So even though we design something really nice, we need to think about the architecture and the craftsmanship for these unknown tools that are coming out in the future. So voice is probably going to be the next big one, is my prediction. Testing, and testing is really important. And when you're doing individual components, you're testing each one and the combination of them. So when we go into combining them and creating pages, what we have are individual components that have been tested, and when they're combined, we know that should be tested, should work really well. As I said, I would show an element collage. So here we have some colors, we have some titles, some headers, some buttons, some form fields, imagery, the media navigation example, and then some blocks over here. So that's kind of what an element collage is. And I'm just using block text in here. Typically it would look like a font. So the idea is that you're laying it out there, you're having discussions from a design development team and talking about the branding and how the brand's going to be evolved. This becomes the blueprint for when this is translated over to HTML and CSS. So instead of thinking about pages, you're thinking about individual components and building them out and the combination of them. The first two places where we like to start on any design are colors and typography. This year I've been working on an open source project every month. One of my projects was this color theory, and I worked with my buddy Tim Vonderlo on this. So we identified that most brands have a primary or secondary color. Sometimes there's tertiary, but let's just forget about that right now, but this can still be applied to it. Then they have an accent color, a dark, and a light. So this becomes a really great palette for designing your interface. But this isn't enough, because what happens is people start making variations of it. So that's where we introduce the dark. So we have the dark primary, the dark secondary, the dark accent, the dark, the dark light. And then we have the light versions of it. We have primary light, we have secondary light, we have accent light, we have dark light, we have light light. And then we have the accent version of it. We have primary accent, secondary accent, accent, dark accent, light accent. Not only is this give you 20 different colors and all these variations, this kind of restricts the, designer error and kind of handcuffs you, but handcuffs you in a good way, because it creates consistency inside here. And it becomes a naming convention for your team. So instead of calling this like aqua up there, you can call it accent primary. And it becomes this easy way to communicate to your team as opposed to talking to a hex value or some kind of arbitrary marketing name for it. And it also allows it to be very flexible because they're semantic, but they're not semantic in the describing of the colors. So you can switch those out very easily across your brand. And especially if you're using preprocessor like SAS and it's a variable name, you can update in one place and it can cascade through all your different applications. And if you have a tertiary, you just follow the same pattern. Another color that we also usually include in here, there's some unique ones like air states and like success states, which don't fall in here. We also like to include the transparencies. So whether that's 70% to 50 to 20 to whatever, those are nice to include in there, and you can also layer them on top of it. And this is an example to kind of explain it really well. It doesn't mean that they have to be monochromatic for each primary, secondary, accent, and dark. In some cases, some of our primary dark isn't the same color as our primary base. So there's that. That's been incredibly helpful for us in conversations with clients. And it's odd how much it applies to brands. Like, especially when I see traditional brand books, I'm like, oh, that's this color, that's this color. It's cool. 2 months ago, I released or published what was called object-oriented typography. This was a concept that I had been working on, again, with Tim Vonderlo and some of the other designers like Sean that I work closely with. And the idea here is that every interface has one large font and one small font. So if you look at HTML, there's what's referred to as H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. H6 is the smallest, H1 is your largest. H4 is equivalent to your base root font size, so the paragraph size. Now with that, there's a variable of what is the 3 size and what's the 4 size. So object-oriented typography is identifying your largest size all the way to your smallest size inside your code as well as in your interface. So it becomes consistent. You're not just making up different sizes. I recorded a video about object-oriented typography. It's about 45 minutes. I love talking about it. I'm trying to hold back on it. But the important thing for today, when we're talking about a style guide, it becomes a page header, a page subheader, a section header, a section subheader, an article header, an article subheader, and then a paragraph or a paragraph header. So what this means is in every interface, we've identified that every website has a page header. Every website has an option for a sub-page header. Same thing with these other categories. By building these out, they become consistent. I know I've done this many times in my career that I've created something like an article header in a variant, and it was just because I was trying to do something really quick. It was my own error. If I would have listed out these categories from the beginning, this would have saved me a lot of development time and a lot of thought from a visual perspective. So this has been incredibly helpful, and the paragraph can be applied to headers. The cool thing about following this approach, that these styles are about not just really separating the structure and the skin, but really about the context for the content. By that I mean in H1 through H6, as well as a paragraph tag in every HTML element, there's a certain use case for it. And by applying these styles, you can have your page header be applied to a paragraph tag, if that's the right context for it, but visually I want my paragraph to look like my header. A lot of developers will misuse some of these base HTML elements just to get the visual representation of what they want, but they're utilizing it they're using it improperly. As I said, I recorded a video on that. So after we take the style guide and some time goes by, after we take the element collage, we create a style guide. And really the benefit is, and this is getting into like the creation side, we can create pages and utilize those core components. So the element collage goes into style guide, and that becomes its own project that's managed, maintained over time. And then we have this page layout. And this becomes a lot quicker to design concepts and pages inside the browser. But this doesn't mean your development team's just doing all the design work. It means that you're pairing up. On my next slide, I'll show how that kind of works. And you can create variants really easily by, again, just utilizing those same components. So this is literally, I took that element collage and combined this and put a representation of 2 different pages. And that didn't even include that much. So a traditional flow may look like, if you have an element collage, we go into wireframes for a project and then create a page concept, and then we have a website. I already explained kind of what an element collage is, but it's those core components. And it happens kind of once in a project. Sometimes people ask you to maintain it. It's nice to not throw it away, but just always have it there if your brand changes or if you want to reference it or apply it to your traditional brand like print stuff. And then the wireframes. And I describe wireframes as prioritization and content requirements. So a lot of times we're not building out like each individual pre-design in a wireframe thing. It's more like block, 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 because what we're really focusing on is getting into the browser. For certain projects, we do page concepts, and this is where I was saying about the combining of the elements. So there's certain things that are way easier to do in the browser, and I can knock out in a couple seconds. And then there's certain things that are quicker to do in Photoshop or Sketch. But what we like to do is kind of have a discussion about which approach that we want to do, who can do it faster, whoever can does it, and sometimes we Frankenstein it, and we talk about it, and then we move it into the browser. Then the last one is the HTML prototype, and it's truly the refinement and definement of the core components. Ideally, the approach that we like to do after we have a style guide is to really go from wireframes. And our wireframes are a lot of times whiteboarding sessions where we're just writing out everything and what needs to be there. If we need it for more technical requirements, we will create something a little bit more formal. But we like to go from whiteboarding to HTML prototypes. And this is kind of a really nice process because it speeds it up. And plus, I can see the mobile version of it at the same time. So that's what you're aiming towards. But it can't solve it all. So just some of the pain points that come over my experience and have building these out for so long is definitely that ongoing politics, who owns it, but also the issues that maybe a designer thinks that you're taking their role away from them, or the developer thinks that, well, now that we have this front end style guide, there's no need for me. But in reality, that's not true, because even if you're utilizing pieces, you still need to craft and architect it out around the unique experience. Politics always gets in the way. They take a lot of effort. These are not something that you can be like, tomorrow we're going to do this and do it. They contain complex methodology, especially from the UI architecture. So when building it out, you need someone with advanced knowledge of these methodologies, approaches. And I'm just scratching the surface on a lot of these things. I could talk for days on this topic. They're platform agnostic. I don't think this is a negative thing, but they only include the front end, the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They're not including documentation on the back end. Maybe your style guide does have design patterns for those, but most likely they're HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They require updates, so a lot of people think once we have it done, it's just done. But things change, browsers change, new devices come out. It's its own project, and it should be managed and maintained like it. So you should always be making small updates and having teams that are kind of dedicated to the growth of it. Those aren't bad pain points, but I've spent way too many times on those. So this is my last section. So 8 benefits. As I said, hopefully these are happy. So number 1 is the improvement and collaboration of designers and developers. This is really, really awesome, that I can sit down on my computer and be like, oh, what's this? Or I can go over someone else's computer and be like, oh, look at this. And then we can actually talk about the experience as opposed to just building something that we've always done. I mean, building out the same thing over and over again. This gets us kind of, again, like that whiteboarding and letting the experts lead their craft at the right time. Second one is reduction in development efforts if done properly, because you already have the pieces and parts kind of there. And the front end can be very expensive. I actually mean expensive to build out, to bring on someone with an advanced level in architecture. But if you do it right, over time, it saves you reduction in development efforts, because you're reusing. Increased speed to market. This is one of the best, and one of my favorites is that because I have these pieces, I can combine them and I can get something done way quicker. When I have to create new things, that's why I say it's always about the combining and reusing. When I have to create something, it does add a little bit of a delay. And even with those delays, it's really quick for me to get something out there. The fourth is the alignment of quality code. This is actually this is more for the developers, but it looks like one developer designed it. You look professional as a company if someone does inspect it. If you're trying to hire developers and they look at the view source and it looks like crap, most developers probably don't want to work at your company. And also that gets into the maintenance and getting your team kind of on the same methodologies and approaches. I hit on this a little bit earlier, but we can focus on the experience as opposed to building out the same button for the 5 millionth time. This is always my argument for the front-end developer that's against style guides, especially a very far-reaching one. Because they're like, you took my job. And it's like, no, we've empowered you to do something better with your time. Think about the next big enhancement to the site as opposed to building the same button for the 5 millionth time. 6, you can iterate in the browser. I've been on the phone call with clients and showed them a comp in the browser, and they ask questions, well, can we change this, can we change this? Usually in the Photoshop days, I'm like, that's going to be expensive because we're going to have to go to the development team afterwards and start that whole process. I can do it live, and they can see the examples. And there's a lot of things that are easier to do in the browser than in code than in Photoshop or Sketch. Flexibility for the ever-changing brand. This was really huge for me. I was working on a project. It went on, we were in the 6th month of it, really far along. I would say like 80% done. We get a phone call from their marketing department who was kind of absent from the project because they had their own redesign going on. We were working on an internal piece, and we were a couple months ahead. They're like, all right, we couldn't tell you this, but we changed their brand. We were able, within 16 hours or 2 days, work really quick and hard to identify what the brand would be and create the components and update their CSS, and it cascaded through the whole experience. So we translated from their former brand to their new brand within 2 working days, which is really, really awesome. that would have been impossible without a style guide. Consistency from both a design and development perspective. I get really annoyed and I get easily distracted when I see inconsistent things. So consistency, again, from color, typography, spacing, it looks buttoned up, it looks professional. And it's also, those types of small consistency pieces make the experience better for a user. Because if you have something that's thrown off, you're going to throw off the user and they have to relearn the experience. So consistency is probably the biggest one. That's why it's an exclamation mark. Consistency. So that's the last one. And then just some quick takeaways of what a good style guide contains. So support for multiple platforms. Even though I said they're platform agnostic, you're looking across all your different applications that are web-based and you're saying these are the different pieces and parts and this can be extended to all these different use cases. So you're thinking about those components of far-reaching, those global ones, those application ones, and making them extendable. Detailed documentation, everyone's favorite thing, documentation, right? Right? But detailed documentation is really what sets it apart. So implementation guidelines as well as the do's and the don'ts. If these don't exist and you're showing like a structure that's going from 3-column to 2-column, someone looks at that, especially that is a non-technical person, like, why is that in there? So you need to kind of explain what those use cases are and why it's there. That lasting one's just so cool. It doesn't compete, so again, this argument too, the bootstrap and the different frameworks that are out there. If you build your style guide right, and even if, say, a campaign or a third party is working on your holiday, your CSS and your style guide shouldn't be competing with other libraries. So if you craft it in the right way, you can write your code so you're not having those conflicts. That one's a little bit more advanced, but it can actually happen very easily. And the last one is really easy to use and understand, not for just developers, but for the people that are going out there and looking at the actual code, making sure that the brand's in check, and creating experiences for users that are really user-centric. So creating an experience of indexing them out, making it easily accessible for editing, viewing, and modifying them. So that's about it. I think I have 4 minutes, so I don't think that's enough time for questions. But thank you guys for attending. I know there were a lot of great presentations going on right now, so it means a lot to me that you showed up for this. I'm Nice Transition on Twitter. I'll be hanging out all around all day today. I'll be at the Cardinal booth off and on, so come talk to me if you want to talk about branding, strategy, style guides, Columbus Web Group, or anything. I enjoy talking. But thank you guys.